The following message is brought to you by the Western Conservatory of the Arts and Sciences.
I want to introduce to you now two young ladies who've been giving some very serious thought to how they can, even when they're in a family and even when they're under the jurisdiction of their father, they could be leaders of society and culture, not by lording it over men, not by teaching men, but in the way that they carry themselves, in the way that they speak, in the way that they redefine things that have been grossly perverted in our day. Femininity. So now, ladies and gentlemen, Sofia and Elizabeth Botkin on dominion-oriented femininity.
One of the themes I'm sure you've noticed is that we need to be prepared to face hard times ahead. America is scheduled for judgment. This is something that my father talked about. We don't know how severe. We don't know what it's going to look like. We don't know what it will consist of. The future is very, very uncertain for us. This is a subject that the men have been talking a lot about, but you young ladies in the audience, you need to be thinking about this too. Because even though it sounds like manly subjects, judgment, war, the economy, all of those things are going to affect us too. We live in the same world that our fathers live in. And when we're married, we're going to live in the same world that our husbands live in. And the hardships that they face, we're going to face them too. So these are topics that we're not too young to be thinking about. We're not too girly to be thinking about. We really need to be focusing on these things too. One of the things that concerns me most about America's future is the fact that most women, but not all, do not know how to be strong anymore. And they are not ready to deal with hard times. And they are not ready to deal with hardships the way they used to be. When you look at pictures of the Pilgrim mothers and of the woman that settled the Wild West and the woman that settled Plymouth, you see strength and you see virtue, something that women don't have today. Women just don't have the moral stamina to face the trials and the hardships that they faced 200 years ago. We've lost the strong moral character and the sturdiness that American women used to be known for. Let me talk about the Pilgrim women for a minute, because the fact that we even have an America to talk about, it's a testimony to the dominion-oriented femininity of the Pilgrim women who sacrificed their lives for other people that they would never see. And they were willing to go through hardships that we cannot even imagine. We selfish, spoiled women in the 21st century cannot even imagine the hardships that they went through. They cared more about people that they would never know than they did about their own comfort. That's something that cannot be said for women of today. They were willing to make their lives harder for the eternal good of those who would be coming later. And if you go to Plymouth, there's a monument to the Pilgrim mothers, which is inscribed with these words right here. They brought up their families in sturdy virtue and a living faith in God, without which nations perish. And 2 centuries later, when Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States in the 1830s, he was struck by the superior strength and character of the American women, and this is what he said about them. If I were asked now that I am drawing to the close of this work, in which I have spoken of so many important things done by the Americans, to what singular prosperity and growing strength of that people ought to mainly be attributed, I would reply, to the superiority of their women. What does that say about the women of today? When you think about the state of America now, if you were to ask me now to what I would attribute the growing apostasy and weakness of America, I might say to the selfish and pettiness of their women. And the products of feminism, 21st century women, that's us, we're not just lesser or weaker, but in so many ways we're the opposite of this women. We're weak in all the ways that they used to be strong. When these women used to make sacrifices, daily sacrifices for their children, women of today sacrifice their children, killing them in the womb as a sacrifice to their own selfishness. And it's really sad. We need to understand how much we've lost. And most of us in this room would probably like to say that we've rejected feminism. But I bet we all wrestle with the weakness and the myopia that we've inherited from that legacy. It's hard for us to think 200 years ahead. It's hard for most of us to want to even think about living the way the Pilgrim women lived, to think about the sacrifices that they made, the hardships that they went through. And when it comes right down to it, we're still confused about the most basic principles of family relations, gender roles, and even the very meaning of womanhood. God has put us into a very unique time in history. We're living in a generation that has no concept of what it means to be a woman. This is singular. I've never seen this in any other generation. Even the word femininity means nothing anymore. I can remember when Elizabeth and I were working on our book, and we kept putting the word femininity, biblical femininity, just all through the book. And Mom came and said to us, I don't even know if I like the word femininity. What does it mean anyway? It has such bad connotations. What does it mean? And Elizabeth and I thought, I don't know. It's an interesting thing. Feminism has separated us from the historical legacy that we had and has left us desolate and confused. 200 or 300 years ago, a young lady would be taught to act like a strong woman by her great-great-great-grandmother, great-great-grandmother, great-grandmother, mother. We don't have that legacy anymore. Feminism just broke that link. So now I kind of feel like we're living on an island. We don't have examples to look to. We have our mothers. But most of our mothers did not have examples to look to. They didn't have mentors. They didn't have grandmothers and great-grandmothers that they could look up to. I actually see this as a great opportunity. Because when you think about it, it's going to be up to us to rebuild the culture of strong, real womanhood in the world. And we have the chance now to build it afresh on the foundations of sola scriptura. And this will require examining every stereotype, every picture, every example, every image. We can look at them, we can disregard the bad, and we can learn from the good. But this really is an incredible opportunity. And when you think about it, when we live in a culture that doesn't understand what womanhood is, you young ladies are going to be the models of this next generation. They're going to be looking to you to set the new standard. This is an incredible opportunity. And what Elizabeth and I will be doing in this lecture is that we will be examining 10 characteristics that constitute the kind of strength and character that our generation will need to face the hardships that are coming, and will need to rebuild what we've lost. Number 1. A dominion woman is a woman of God. When it comes to becoming the sort of women that we want to be, the first thing that we need to understand is that what we want really doesn't matter. Around the time that we started writing our book, and I'm sure that you young ladies have experienced this as well, people would be asking us, okay, so what do you want to do? What are you going to do with your life? What do you want to do? And I actually know that that's a loaded question. It doesn't just mean what kind of career do you want to have. It really means what causes will you be giving your life for? What God are you going to serve? What are you going to live and die for? What is your life going to count for? That's really what the question means. And it comes down to this, ultimately. Are we going to pursue what we want for our lives or what God wants for our lives? There's an ancient saying that I first read in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which goes like this: what every woman wants most is to have her own way. I think that's true. And I think this statement really captures the essence of feminism. It's a desire to be a law unto ourselves. It's a desire, basically, to usurp God's authority and to determine what is right and wrong for ourselves. It's a desire to be God, or to be a goddess. And it stands against God's law, his law of hierarchy and authority, and ultimately against God himself. And the dominion-oriented woman is submitted to God. And she's submitted herself entirely to what his will for her life will be. She said, I am not God, you are God. Not my will be done, but your will be done. And the way that she knows what his will is that she seeks the scriptures diligently on her own for herself. She doesn't wait for someone else to tell her what to do or how to live. And the principles that Elizabeth and I are about to bring to you today really aren't going to make sense, and they're not going to work if you don't have this attitude, if you don't fear God. And they might sound like good ideas, they might sound romantic, they might sound practical, but if you don't have the right attitude, if you don't truly fear God as your sovereign, as your head, then they're really not going to work for you. So dominion-oriented femininity requires understanding that we've been bought with a price. We do not belong to ourselves. It's not our way, it's God's way. And now I think Elizabeth's bringing us number 2.
Point number 2 is a Dominion woman understands what the difference is between real femininity and false femininity. This is important. There are a lot of theories of femininity going around that we need to examine biblically. For example, some people say femininity is the opposite of masculinity. Well, certainly, we're supposed to be different from men, but that doesn't necessarily mean opposite. Another one is some people think femininity is whatever the feminists have rejected. Well, that's bad hermeneutics, because we have to be careful that we don't build our philosophy of womanhood or of anything else on a knee-jerk reaction to something bad, as though the thing that's bad is what actually determines our morality. The Bible is our only standard, and it should be our motivation to do right. Some people say that biblical femininity is any picture of womanhood that was around before the women's suffrage movement. Well, the thing is, feminism has been around since the Garden of Eden, and it's had advocates in every single century. So the actual meaning of femininity is really extremely simple, and we see it in the first couple of chapters of the Bible. So here in Genesis 2, God reveals to us the essence of femininity when he shows us how Eve was meant to correlate to Adam. He said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make him a helper suitable for him." So here we see the woman was made for the man, like it says in 1 Corinthians 11:9. We see she's a different creature. She's made for a different purpose. And her role is different, which we see in Genesis 3. She is supposed to look different, as we see in Deuteronomy 22:5. And we should rejoice in that difference, because that is the difference that makes us complementary to the man. And the purpose of this difference, which we call femininity, is to help masculinity and to suit masculinity, to complement it and complete it. And the two of them together will be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. So we could sum up by saying true femininity is about helping men fulfill their calling. Any departure from this is a departure from biblical femininity. Throughout the Bible and throughout history, we actually only see two kinds of womanhood. The kind that devotes its identity to helping men fulfill their calling, and the kind that wants power over men. The first one lives a life of self-sacrifice. The latter wants to have its own way. The latter is what we call feminism. A lot of us think of feminism as being ugly and androgynous, but feminism appears in many guises throughout history. Sometimes it's trying to subdue masculinity with its womanly wiles and charms. Sometimes feminism is vain and narcissistic and self-absorbed. It's ornamental, it's useless, and it's not interested in helping men take dominion. It's interested in itself. And sometimes it's trying to compete with masculinity and outman it. But there's one thing that's consistent in all of these manifestations. Feminism is always independent, and it's always self-seeking, and its desire is to weaken and dominate men. Understanding this is extremely helpful when it comes to sorting through all the images around us. And there are two in particular that we believe are leading girls away from biblical femininity. One is floozy femininity, which uses its beauty to show off and try to gain power over men. It's what the world calls femininity, but we cannot let it confuse us. It's distinct from masculinity, but it's not gentle and quiet. It's not modest and discreet. We should ask ourselves, is this an asset to mankind or is it a liability? Is it like Mary, the mother of God, or is it like Delilah? If we ask these questions and judge by these standards, it becomes clear that this kind of femininity is not biblical femininity. And then in the opposite camp, we've known girls who've turned away from femininity because they learned from Barbie dolls that femininity is for bimbos. And so they become bitter about their God-given femininity. They become ashamed of it. They try to hide it under men's clothes. Sometimes they become bitter towards men as well. And they're not complimenting men and filling that which is lacking. So this is the challenge of trying to rediscover biblical femininity, trying to sort through all the images and stereotypes from the past, looking for good examples. There are many great legacies for us in history, if we can find them. But we have to remember no era and no image is perfect. We have an amazing opportunity before us right now to build a new culture of femininity, something completely new and different on the foundation of the Bible alone.
Now, Reverend William Einwechter, who's one of our favorite theologians, he explains the Hebrew word help as in helpmeet, izar, comes from two roots. The first meaning to rescue or save, and the second meaning to be strong. It indicates one who is able and who has what it takes to come to the aid of someone who is in need. Thus, God created the woman so that she would be able to come to the aid of the man and be his support and help. She's only going to figure out her purpose if she realizes his. And thus, it is absolutely in keeping with biblical womanhood, imperative even, for a woman to understand and appreciate men and their world. And this is one thing that Elizabeth and I kind of struggled with when we were little. I was extremely feminine in one sense of the word because I would dress up in pretty flouncy pink costumes, and I would skip around the house singing songs and quoting lines from romantic poems and things. And I would look down on what my brothers were doing outside in the mud. I was so feminine. But actually that attitude was very feministic. And as I grew up, I kept having this disdain for masculinity. Well, I'm feminine. This is the way I express my femininity. It's different. I'm not part of their world. I'm pink. They're blue. We're different. This is actually not a biblical idea at all. The idea that femininity is the opposite of masculinity, that's a very dangerous, unbiblical idea. They're different, but they are not opposite. They're complementary. And so the idea that women and men live in different worlds, the woman lives in a pink world, the man lives in a blue world, that's totally, totally unbiblical. And so people have often asked us, is it feminine for girls to be inspired by the masculinity of their brothers and their fathers and to enjoy the things that their brothers do? And I would say the answer is yes. I think it's feministic for girls to grow up having a contempt for those things. And girls who are trying to understand their position as women need to eschew the false notion that women live in different worlds. We were created to be different. But we live in the same world, we have the same goal. And in our pursuit of being women, we need to make sure that we don't abandon our men. And one thing that we need to remember is that brave, adventurous men need women who can come alongside them in the rigors of their lives. And sometimes that means going outside and helping your brother to build a tree fort. Sometimes it means, when you're married, helping your husband build his house. Femininity is not all about staying inside the house and feeding upon sugar and cream and cross-stitching. That's another thing that Elizabeth and I had to figure out along the way.
Point number 4 is, a dominion woman is invested in the family that God gave her. One verse that we love to look at about this is Psalm 144. And it says in verse 12, "Let our sons in their youth be as grown-up plants, and our daughters as corner pillars fashioned as for a palace." This is an amazing piece of imagery we have here. One of the Webster's 1828 definitions of the word pillar is a supporter, that which sustains or upholds, that on which some superstructure rests. And this helps us understand a little more about what the role of a daughter is in her family. She doesn't just have an ornamental role. She's there actually to help hold up her family, to help support her family. But the other thing I get from this verse is, this is not a crude, roughly hewn pillar that this girl is. She's been polished, very carefully polished, so that she not only gives strength to the home, but she also provides grace and beauty to the home. It's also interesting to me, this verse seems to presuppose that a woman will be living at home with her family. But we need to realize there is a way a girl can live in her home without really living in her home. Her body can be there, but her mind can be somewhere completely different. Her heart can be somewhere different. We've known girls who have removed themselves from the home in every way except physically. And I think the reason is because all families have problems, and some girls see the problems in their families, and they become sullen, they become bitter. They give up on making anything change. And daughters can help make things change, but some girls give up. And they withdraw into themselves and into their own little private world, their dreams, their fantasies, their novels, whatever they like to use to help them escape. They're waiting for something better. They say, we're waiting till we get married. That's when our life is really going to start. That's the family that'll be our real family. And so they're not engaged in the home. They're not engaged in the relationships there. They're not engaged in the business of the home. They're not trying to improve the atmosphere of the home. Their energies are not focused on their families. And sometimes we've heard them say, well, why should I get really invested in this family? Because I'm just going to be leaving soon. Those are the girls who never leave. Because what young man is going to look at a young woman who's not invested in the relationships God gave her and say, that's the kind of wife I want. That's the kind of wife I want helping me and raising my children. Those girls do not usually get married. And so we all need to be invested in the families the Lord has given us right now. And that takes Anna to our next point,
which is number 5. A Dominion woman lives in the real world. And I want to talk about something that a lot of us young ladies have a tendency to do. We women love beautiful, feminine, romantic pictures, don't we? But let me tell you something about these images. This is not a picture of the real world. This is not even an accurate depiction of history. This is not what women looked like during the Roman and Greek era or the medieval era. These are romantic depictions of history. Real life doesn't look like this. Real women don't look like this. Real houses don't look like this. But we young ladies can have a tendency to idolize these beautiful, feminine, romantic images and to lose ourselves in the beauty and the romance. But this is something that we need to be extremely careful about. And when we look around our world and we can see that it's unromantic, it's ugly, it's ungodly, it's perishing, it's so easy for us to want to escape into these beautiful romantic pictures and want to just lie around, oh, if only the world were like this, if only homes looked like this, if only we looked like this. I'm sure that things were much more romantic in history. It's too bad things are so unromantic now. This is a very dangerous thing for girls to do. And girls can do this by looking at pictures. They can retreat into books. They can retreat into movies, romance novels. There are so many different avenues available for young ladies to want to escape to. And we need to be grateful for the battleground that God has given us and not desire to live in a different sphere or a different generation or a different world or a world that never existed. It's not for us to wish that we could have authority in the gates. And it's not for us to wish that we could live in Jane Austen's England or Victorian high society, and we really should not wish that we lived in Greek and Roman times. It's not for us to escape into fantasy worlds. This messed up world, this crooked and perverse generation, this America which is scheduled for judgment is the world that God chose for us, and it's the world that we need to be thankful for. It's part of our sin nature to want to escape. And Rushdoony has a really great quote about that I want to read aloud. Men who will not be governed by God's word will not be governed by reality, because reality is not of their making. God having created all things, reality reflects the mind of God, not man. Hence, it is the essence of sin to resort to imagination to escape God's law world. This problem is a very urgently practical one because every facet of the life of modern man is governed by imagination. This is basic to humanism, and it affects all men born of Adam, and especially modern man. Because Christians are born into a fallen world and often educated by it, imagination replaces reality in their thinking and it governs them. Part of the reason that girls seek to escape is because they're bored. Part of the reason girls seek to escape is because they're not satisfied with where God has put them. And it's the easiest way to deal with hardship. This is something that I've had a tendency to do. This is something that Elizabeth has had a tendency to do. I think this is something that we all have a tendency to do, and we need to be very careful about this. Elizabeth and I have done a lot of research online and talking to young ladies. One of the things that we've noticed is that they all have a tendency to escape into novels. We didn't realize that this was as big a deal as it really is, but 90% of the young ladies that we've talked to have at one point been addicted to romance novels, even if they wouldn't call them novels. It's partly because as homeschoolers, we love to read, but it can become an idol for us, as it has for so many of the young women that we've talked to. One of the attributes of a Dominion woman, number 5, was she lives in the real world. Number 6 is a Dominion woman embraces a hard life, and a Dominion woman loves a hard life.
Number 7 is, a Dominion woman thinks like a shepherd. Jesus said, "Do you love me? Feed my sheep." And this is a basic Christian duty that we have, to make disciples of all the nations. And this, for many of us young homeschooled girls, this is going to involve overcoming obstacles like shyness and timidity. This can be very hard for us. I used to be extremely shy. I used to be so shy, I had a hard time talking to a person one-on-one, let alone even thinking about standing up on stage and speaking to over 500 people like I'm doing right now. And I realized after a while that my shyness was a result of two things: excessive focus on self and fear of man. That's what shyness always is. And my father helped me understand this was something I needed to get over. And so he told me, you need to focus on other people. And when you do that, your shyness will go away. And he was right. It did. But if we're going to be shepherds, we have to learn to stop thinking about ourselves, and we have to learn to love the other people that we're supposed to be ministering to. We can't retreat into ourselves. We have to ignore our comfort zone and reach out to others. And the good thing is, when we're thinking like that, it gives us boldness in how we interact with people. Some girls have told us that they panic or they break out in a cold sweat when someone asks them, "So what do you do?" I'm sure you've all gotten that question, and I'm sure you know it. It's an interesting question to be asked. And I'm not sure why it's frightening for some girls. I guess because they're afraid of disapproval or confrontation. But instead, I think we should look at this question as an opportunity to talk to people about the beauties of God's design. Why should we be ashamed? We have nothing to be ashamed of. God's ways are wiser than the heathen's ways. And we should be happy whenever someone gives us the opportunity to explain that. Here's a verse I love in Deuteronomy 4. Moses has just given the Israelites several of God's commands and says, "So keep them and do them, for that is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples who will hear all these statutes and say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people.' For what nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God whenever we call on him? Or what nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I am setting before you today?" Honestly, what nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as the law which we have? And we need to not assume that the other nations are going to be hostile or look down on us, because they don't sometimes. A lot of people have responded very interestingly when Anna and I tell them what we're doing and why. A lot of girls actually have responded very wistfully and said, "You know what? I wish I could do that. I would love nothing more than to be able to do that." A lot of people can see the wisdom in what we're doing. But we have to be bold in our witness.
Moving on to number 8. A Dominion woman strengthens her arms and trains her mind. Now, one of the things that our family has been accused of is that we don't believe that women should be educated. I don't know how many times we can say this, but we've said it as many times as we possibly can. We believe that Christian women, Christian young women, need to be the best educated women in the world in the right ways and for the right reasons. And a useful woman, a Dominion woman, the kind that we've been describing here today, is one who has been equipped for the battle, is ready for all the duties of life, is ready for anything that life might bring her. She's ready to live in a 400 square foot, almost finished house, or she is ready to be the president's daughter, or she's ready to live in a mud hut in Africa. She's ready for anything and everything. One thing that we need to be asking ourselves is, what is the goal of our education? What are we really preparing to do? And here's a quote by William B. Sprague in a letter to his daughter that I really like. And he says, "The object of education is twofold: to develop the faculties and to direct them, to bring out the energies of the soul, and to bring them to operate to the glory of the Creator. In other words, it is to render yourself useful to the extent of your ability." So the purpose of our education is to equip us for the great assignment as women, to be helpers suitable to brave Dominion men who have the task of discipling the nations, and to be the mothers and teachers of the future generations of Christian warriors. And if we want to raise our sons to be the next presidents, preachers, filmmakers, writers, culture changers, we are going to need to have an excellent education. Now, the question is, well, how do we go about that? How do we educate ourselves in these ways? And I have another quote here that I really like by John Taylor Gatto, who is the former New York Times Teacher of the Year. And he says, "Close reading of tough-minded writing is still the best, cheapest, and quickest method known for learning to think for yourself. Reading and a rigorous discussion of that reading is a way that obliges you to formulate a position and support it against objections. It is an operational definition of education in its most fundamental civilized sense. And I might say even better than reading books is writing books. One thing that I think I mentioned in the last part was novels and fiction, and how young ladies can read too many of those and they can escape through them and they can become enraptured by them. And that's not the only reason why I would caution girls not to read them. The other reason is that there are so many other books that need to be read right now. Elizabeth and I have a reading list that's about a mile long, and I don't know if we're ever going to get through it. Some of the subjects that we're studying right now are theology and worldview, writing and communication, history, and understanding the times. There's so much to study, there's so much to learn, and I do believe that reading books is the best way to do that.
Number 9 is, a Dominion woman is doing her husband good during these years of her life. In Proverbs 31, it says the Proverbs 31 woman is doing her husband good and not evil all the days of her life. And it's interesting to me that it doesn't say she does him good and not evil as soon as she's married to him. But it actually says she's doing him good and not evil all the days of her life. That means now. That means today we can be doing our husbands good, even if we don't know who they are. And one of the ways we can be doing that is to be diligently amassing the skills and the character and the knowledge that our husbands are going to need to have behind them to help them in the dominion task they have ahead of them. A lot of us have fairly high standards for our husbands, but how high are our standards for ourselves? If we have a list of requirements that's a mile long for our husbands, we better have a list that's 2 miles long for ourselves. So I think we need to ask ourselves, why would a man like the kind we want to marry a woman like us? And the correct answer isn't, well, because I'm a woman. I'm a young woman, and I like children, and I can cook, and what more would a man want? The thing is, a man who's fighting the important battles is going to need a little more than that. He's going to need a wife who can be a wise counselor to him. He's going to need a wife who can help sharpen him as iron sharpens iron. My favorite example of this is my mother. I love watching my mother's relationship with my father. In addition to being a loving mother and a wonderful cook and a wonderful housekeeper, she is a wise counselor. She's a delightful companion. She's a very stimulating conversationalist. She's constantly reading and always has fascinating things to tell my father that he can put into his speeches and into his teaching that he does. She models all of the things that Dad has always wanted his family to be known for: dominion focus, ingenuity, creativity, courage, a pioneer spirit, entrepreneurialism, love of learning. This is why my father's heart can safely trust in her. She delights him with her company and her conversation. She sustains him with her strength. She stimulates him and sharpens him with her wisdom. She emboldens him with her praise. She bolsters him with her cheerfulness, constant cheerfulness in spite of whatever's going on. She comforts him with her love, and she heartens him with her courage. Wives like this are a source of constant good to their husbands. So we need to be working today, diligently, to become this kind of woman. Another thing we can do to be doing our husbands good is to be developing a selfless instead of a selfish view of marriage. It's not about making us happy. It's about serving God. It's about helping our husbands to take dominion. And so instead of filling our minds with all these rosy romantic ideas of how our husbands are going to meet our needs, we need to be thinking about how we can meet their needs. So we're not going to be needy, discontent, complaining wives.
Okay, now here's our final point here, number 10. A Dominion woman understands the times. I explained some of the problems that we're facing in our generation at the beginning of the speech. And a lot of you young ladies are probably thinking, well, what am I going to do about it? What can I do? And part of the reason why girls do escape through the different avenues that we talked about, romance novels, films, images, or just our own sinful imaginations, is because they have no idea what they can be doing. And one of the principles that our father taught us when we were younger is that we needed to be looking for the needs of the moment, actively looking for the needs of the moment. There are so many things that young women can do if they have their eyes open. And the first place to be looking is just in your own family. Be looking around your family for the needs. How can you be helping your mother? How can you be helping your father? Have you gone to him and asked him, Daddy, how can I help you? Have you done this with your mother? Have you looked at your siblings? Have you looked at ways that you can be supporting them and ways that you can be helping them? And then beyond your family, your church community, are there young ladies in the church that need encouragement, that need someone to talk to? Are there mothers in the church that need help because they have so many children? There are so many needs. We just need to open our eyes and see them. I want to leave you with hope. Please do not underestimate the importance of what you're doing in your home. It really is making a difference. The world really is a different place because of stay-at-home daughters. And I want to get you excited about this. You may not know it, but there is a battle raging around you, and you are in the thick of it right where you are. It's tempting for us to think that the interesting and important things are happening somewhere else, but actually they're happening on the home front. They're happening at homes, in families. I can't think of another battleground that's thicker than the one that you have in your home right now, because the state of a nation is always determined by the state of the home. This is exciting too. You may think that the stay-at-home daughter movement is a little hole-in-the-wall movement that nobody knows about, but actually, that's not true anymore. Elizabeth and I got into a feminist forum one time, a very well-known feminist forum, and guess what they were talking about? They were talking about us. They were talking about you. And you know why? Because they're afraid. Because they see you as a threat. And they understand that the stay-at-home mommy movement, while it's important, women can stay at home for selfish reasons and for reasons of convenience. But the daughters who are choosing to stay at home and serve the families are up to something. And they're scared. So you can be excited about that. We're not an invisible movement anymore. People know about us. This is an exciting time to be alive. The future is changing, and there are great opportunities that come with that. And I want to leave you all with a quote by Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams was writing to her son, John. This was during the Revolutionary War, which were very turbulent, difficult times, kind of like the ones that we're facing now. And she said, "These are the times in which a genius would wish to live. It's not in the still calm of life or in the repose of a Pacific station that great characters are formed. The habits of a vigorous mind are formed in contending with difficulties. Great necessities call out great virtues." Thank you.
For more resources to inspire and equip your family, visit us online at westernconservatory.com.